Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to our church service today. We love that we get a chance to be with you online. You're going to get the most out of today by pairing this broadcast experience with our app. So take a moment, download the app, and explore the features that you can use to follow along, like a response card, notes section, and Bible. If you want to be a part of the movement at Grace Church and further the work that God's doing through services just like this one, you can give right on our website or through your app. It's easy, safe, and quick. Thanks so much for being a part of what God's doing right here in Wayne County. We'll be starting our service in just a moment.
Good morning, everybody. Man, I love seeing each one of you here today. Thanks for joining us. We're going to do a little bit of a poll to kind of kick things off this morning. I need you to raise your hands really high if you have ever been criticized. Raise your hand. Put it up there. Keep it up there. Look around. You are in good company, right? Okay, put it down. That's fine. Pretty much everyone has had to deal with the critic, right? Somebody criticizes you. They're gifted as the fault finder, right? They're the person that kind of points anything out to everyone that is just a little off, right? Well, everybody knows somebody who is a critic, and we've had to learn how to deal with the critic. And criticism can come at us from a variety of different places. It can come at us in the relationships that matter most, like in our home. Maybe a critical person that you deal with is your spouse, right? They kind of pick apart what you wear, how you talk. Maybe they're even picky about how you load the dishwasher or unload the dishwasher, right? And so it gets you into criticism. And I was thinking about guys especially, how when you're in a marriage relationship and maybe you feel like your spouse is criticizing you, your wife is criticizing you. It's just a little bit of a marriage advice, okay? 9 out of 10 husbands agree their wife is always right? The 10th mysteriously disappeared, right, and hasn't been heard from since, right? Just go with it, roll with it, it goes way better for you. No, just kidding. But maybe your criticism doesn't come from the home. Maybe it comes from work, where you've got a boss and you're like, I never really know where I stand with this person until I do it wrong. And then he or she, man, they just come down hard on me. And I wish I would know ahead of time if I'm doing the right thing or not, but it's too late by then. Or perhaps your criticism comes from your parents or your in-laws, and they critique every single decision you make, how you raise your kids or the way you spend your money. Or criticism comes from friends, right, who are observing your life and making statements about who you are. Criticism can come from anywhere. People criticize anything, right? Like this week, I learned that people criticize church. I was shocked to learn this, right? How many of you have ever heard someone criticize Grace Church? Raise your hand if you ever heard that. Really? I'm shocked. Like, too big, too trendy. The preacher doesn't preach about, fill in the blank of my favorite topic, enough. The preacher doesn't preach about, fill in the blank with my least favorite topic, too much, or he preaches too much about that, right? Tons of criticism. Criticism can come from anywhere, and we have to learn how to deal with it. Aristotle said it this way: to avoid criticism, do nothing, say nothing, and be nothing. I thought, okay, now, far be it from me to criticize Aristotle, but if you do nothing, say nothing, and become nothing, you're going to be criticized for being lazy, right? Because criticism is all around us. If you're alive, you deal with it. And here's the bottom line truth about criticism: it hurts. It stings. It doesn't feel good. It goes in line with the words from the writer of the Proverbs. The words of the reckless pierce like swords. When someone levels criticism at you, it comes at you like a sword, and it leaves a wound that is deep. And some of you, you've walked into this service today or you're listening online, and listen, this is what you're struggling with. You're still living with the reality of words that somebody told you years ago. You're allowing your life to be controlled by someone who was a critic. We've all been there. Maybe you've seen the kids' movie Wreck-It Ralph, where Ralph becomes a YouTube star. And with that comes all this accolade. And he walks into this room and he sees all of the comments that are positive, and he gets super excited, and then, starts reading the negative ones, right? And we've all walked into a room like Ralph walked into when we saw what people really think of us. Watch this clip.
Wreck-It Ralph is back. Hey, you're talking about me. Gee whiz, the internet is so positive. Fix-It Felix Jr. was my favorite game. Mine too. Ralph's videos stink. What? So stupid. Ralph is the worst. I hate him. He's so fat and ugly. Just a worthless bum alone on a pile of bricks.
We've all been there, right? When we first hear what other people really think of us, when they say that thing that makes us go, is that how I come off? Is that really who I am? Those critical thoughts. Hey, they like me. Oh, no, now they hate me. And what happens to us when we hear those criticisms? All of a sudden it starts to eat at our soul, right? And then it affects other relationships because we're short or mean or quick-tempered with other people because we're not handling criticism well over here. Bottom line is criticism crushes our connection with other people. It's a toxic habit that erodes at these relationships that matter most. It chips away at our self-esteem, and it destroys intimacy, and it creates this emotional distance between people. It devalues people, it belittles people, and frankly, it never actually accomplishes what it sets out to. Criticism is when I communicate a little bit of a complaint about somebody in the form of a character flaw. And over the next few weeks, listen, I'm asking God that He would use our time together for you and me to teach us from His Word how we can heal and restore relationships that have been hurt by criticism and other things that crush that connection, right? The writer of the Proverbs says, the words of the reckless critic hurt. But in this series, and over these few weeks, I want us to keep reading. Yes, it's true that the words of the reckless pierce like swords, but there's another option. The tongue of the wise, that brings healing. We have a chance as followers of Jesus to speak life into spaces that seem to be dead, into relationships that were broken and hurting, and we have the chance to bring hope and healing. But to do that, we have to be wise. This is the tongue of the wise brings healing. And so here's the problem. When it comes to criticism, the criticism that we make about other people, we are really quick when we are overly critical to point out that what we're really doing is just providing feedback and evaluation. That's where we land. But then when other people criticize us, we're overly sensitive and we say very quickly, you're judging me. Right? We're overly critical and overly sensitive. And we're going to have to figure out how to balance that tension because we actually need criticism in our lives. Constructive criticism helps. Sometimes we need help identifying it, and we have to know the difference between constructive and not constructive criticism. So I put a little bit of a chart together for us to kind of walk us through that. We're going to call feedback constructive criticism and judgment not constructive criticism. So let's take a look at the differences. Judgment focuses on what's wrong. Hey, I'm going to tell you what you did wrong, and that's all I'm going to tell you. I'm going to just keep pointing out your error, your faults, and your failures. While feedback says, hey, that is what is wrong, and here's an idea, or here's a way we could make that right. Here's a way we could improve that. Judgment says, hey, that thing that you did wrong, that's because that's who you are. It's a character flaw. Where feedback says, no, that is the thing that you did, but instead I want you to know, I know that's not who you are, and that's not who you want to become. I know you're more than what you did. Judgment says, hey, we're going to focus on the past, and we're going to throw as much blame and shame as we can into the game. where feedback says, hey, I'm going to point you to the future and talk about hope and the way that you can overcome. And maybe the biggest here at the bottom for the critic, judgment is allowing me to have control and to get my way and to keep it inside the box that works for me. Feedback says, you know what? That didn't fit inside my box, and I don't understand exactly where you're coming from, but I respect the fact that you could be coming from somewhere different, right? And so these are the way that you can identify what's constructive and what's not constructive, because we need constructive criticism. And everybody faces the critic. Sometimes it's the critic from the outside that's just firing away at us, and sometimes it's the critic on the inside that's growling and leashing out to other people. We will either face the critic or we become the face of the critic. Either way, we have some lessons to learn. And so this morning, I've created an outline for you in your worship program. I want to walk you through 2 different lessons we can learn in order to deal with the critic, okay? Number 1 is this. We're going to have to figure out how to avoid being the critic. We are all dealing with criticism, but the truth of the matter is we all kind of tend to be the critic. And it kind of plays out this way in our lives. We would say, well, I give feedback when I'm giving criticism, and you're just critical. Or I am just firm on the things that I believe, but when someone else is that way, we call them stubborn. Well, I'm very flexible. I like to roll with the punches, but when someone else does it, we call them wishy-washy. Right? Or I'm in touch with my emotions, but when someone else claims to be in touch with their emotions, we call them hysterical. Right? We quickly identify the fact that we're overcritical and they're oversensitive. And so before we can handle the critic in our life, we have to deal with the critic in our heart, deep inside all of us. One of the most famous sermons of all time was the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gave. It's recorded in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 7, and Jesus shares these words with us as he's dealing with the critic or the judger. Jesus' words, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you'll be judged. And with the same measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, then you'll be able to see clearly and remove the speck from your brother's eye." When we're critical, overly critical, and judgmental, we are literally deflating people's lives. It's like being a person who grabs a push pin and goes to the Wayne County Fair and finds every child they can and pops their balloon. You would call that person a creep and a mean person, right? But this is what we do in life when we're critical of other people. We will point out the flaws and the failures that as many as we possibly can, because it doesn't fit inside of our box and we're super, super judgmental. Like, I can't believe she wore that. Whew, right? I can't believe he said that. This time I'm grabbing that thing, right? You're sitting in a cubicle at work and the person next to you is like, I can't believe you can't spell. And we just keep walking around popping everybody's balloon. That's what criticism does. I love how the Message Bible paraphrases Jesus' words in Matthew 7 here. He says, don't pick on people. Don't jump on their failures. Don't criticize their faults. Unless, of course, you want the same treatment. That critical spirit has a way of boomeranging. I love that. That's great. It's easy to see a smudge on your neighbor's face and be oblivious to the ugly sneer on your own. Those are powerful words. Inside of all of us is a critic. And a critic walks around popping everybody's balloon. And that's the opposite of wisdom and the way of wisdom. Instead of popping people's balloons, we can use our words to fill their life with life. See, the words that we use matter. We can encourage, we can build up, we can unite, or we can discourage, we can divide, and we can tear down. All of that comes from the power of our words. Now, when we are critical, we like to kind of like soften the blow a little bit, so we'll say phrases like, I'm just saying, or I like to speak my mind, or, hey, no hard feelings, just trying to keep it real. The truth of the matter is we're critical. We're just plain critical. Everybody raised their hand when I asked, how many people have ever dealt with criticism? I bet the survey'd be different if I asked, how many people would admit today in front of all these people here at church, you're a critic? I am. I'm a critic at times. Oftentimes, the reason is because we make our judgments too quickly. We either don't listen completely or we don't listen at all. And the author of Proverbs warned us about that. He said, listen, to answer before listening, that's folly and shame. To do something and not get the context of what it is and just to spew out your perspective and your bubble little box worldview, whatever it is foolish. Jumping to conclusions is the special temptation of the self-important. The arrogant, the unteachable, the prejudice. The writer of Proverbs says that's folly, that's foolishness. Instead, we should pursue the way of wisdom, right? Instead of having these relationships that we care about crumble because of our own foolishness, we could pursue the way of wisdom. And the way of wisdom thinks about what we say before we say it. Wisdom seeks to understand before it speaks to be understood. Wisdom weighs our words carefully. It thinks before it speaks. It waits before it sends. I thought, man, look at this passage. How much less would I say if I just lived this out? There's no room for overly critical behavior in this. I have the freedom to be even-tempered and come from a less emotional state of mind. And so this is not a feel-good talk, frankly, because I believe that all of us are critical. So as you start thinking about that, for a minute, let's give some critical thought to why we're critical, okay? If it helps you to assume that you're thinking about the person sitting next to you, I guess go do it, but I think it's really about you too, okay? Why are we critical? There's not a million answers to this question. We're critical of other people because we don't feel good about ourselves. Our self-esteem is bad and low. We enjoy the faults and failures of other people. That's why gossip is so juicy. Gossip wouldn't be juicy if we had good self-image. If we have bad self-image, it's more fun to watch someone else suffer because it makes us feel a little bit better about ourselves, right? Sometimes we do it because we just want to justify our own behavior. Like, hey, well, did you hear that they're doing that? That makes me feel better because I'm doing something a little less, worse. But did you hear what they're doing? So we do it because we don't have a good self-image, because we like to see faults and failures in others, and to justify our own behavior. There's some critical thought as to why we're critical. That's not a healthy place to be. Instead, we should remember, hey, if I want to kill the critic inside, how about I start from the place that I don't have it all figured out? I've got my own set of faults and failures. And I haven't arrived. That's the way to kill the critic. Be a student, ask questions, admit your faults and failures, and then trust God. Allow God to be the judge. Let him be the one that does the work. Don't try to take God's job. He's pretty good at it. If we want to learn to deal with a critic, we got to start inside. First lesson, avoid being the critic. Second lesson, learning to deal with the critic, right? How do you deal with the critic? As soon as someone starts criticizing you and starts flying at you, how do you deal with the criticism? Because this is how it feels when people criticize us, right? This is the scene that we think of. We think of this, small room in a prison cell. It's really dark. There's one light right on us and one chair. We're sitting in the chair across from some investigator, and they're scrutinizing every single thing that we're saying. Every word, every motive, every fear, every failure, every fault, it's being exposed right here. That's how it feels when you're criticized, that you're sitting in that chair, right? And so how do you respond to that? Well, everybody typically falls into one of two sides here. You either fight and you put on the boxing gloves and you start fighting back and defending yourself, right? Or you take flight. You get out of there. You avoid it. You don't like the conflict. You don't want to talk about it, so you run away. You either fight or you take flight. Guess what? Neither one's right. I didn't really mean for that to rhyme, but it did work. Okay? Neither one's right. So how do you really deal with it? How do you deal with these critics? How do you deal with that criticism? I want to share with you 3 principles that are kind of like guide rails for you when you deal with criticism. And I prayed over these this week. I think they're freeing, and I hope they're freeing for you. So how do you deal with a critic? Here's the first one. Sometimes you should dismiss it quietly. Sometimes you should dismiss it quietly. How you respond when someone criticizes you matters. It can take a situation that's not good and not healthy and make it much worse, or it can take that situation and bring healing to it, right? And if we make it much worse, what happens is deep inside of our soul, we start to crumble and our heart starts to get hard and bitter because we're upset because someone criticized us. And because of that, we go over here in this other context with these other people we love, and we're short and we're mean and we're rude with them, and they're like, I don't know what's wrong with you today. And we don't realize that because we didn't handle this criticism well, it's affecting all of these other relationships that aren't connected. Criticism crushes connection. That's just how it works. Now, when you are criticized, you should take every one of those genuinely and consider it. But that doesn't mean you always should respond to it. A great example of this is Jesus. He comes to earth, lives a sinless life, never messed up, 0 faults, 0 failures, and ends up on trial. Unjustly and not fair. And Peter, one of his first followers, he records the story. He says, when they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Jesus was criticized. The perfect, sinless Son of God was criticized. You want to know what they said about him? That Jesus guy, he hangs out with the wrong crowd too much. That Jesus guy, that's crazy. That dude is certifiably crazy. He thinks he's the Son of God. You know what the religious people said about Jesus? They're like, he's a heretic. All those were leveled at Jesus. Now, when I thought about that, there was a little bit of relief to that. Because if Jesus was perfect and they criticized him, then it makes sense why I'm criticized, because I'm not perfect. And Jesus stood there and did not retaliate, made no threats, didn't respond. He dismissed it quietly. Sometimes dismissing it is important because, frankly, you're very unlikely to change their mind anyway. A wise person used to say to me all the time, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. You're not going to change their mind. And when someone's criticizing you and you have the chance to not respond, it might be because they're coming from a place of hurt. My wife is so good at reminding me of this all the time, and I need it. She's like, you have no idea what's going on in their world. Maybe they're hurting. Maybe they're suffering. Ask questions. Find out what's really going on. That's great wisdom, because hurting people hurt people, and maybe that's why they're lashing out at you. And so sometimes when you hear the criticism and it's not true and it's not constructive, the best thing to do is dismiss it and move on. This is a word for somebody, I'm convinced, that you have not moved on from something someone has said about you, and it's still defining you here today. Listen, don't give critics more words than they deserve. Doesn't mean you have to respond to everything. Sometimes the best thing to do is go, hey, that's not constructive and you don't believe in me, I'm moving on. I'm going to dismiss it quietly. Okay? That's a principle. But there's another time when you might need to answer it. Sometimes you dismiss it quietly. Sometimes you answer it gently. Sometimes you give an answer to something. At some point in your life, you're going to do something and people are going to criticize you, right? You're going to go back to school and people are going to be like, why are you wasting your money on doing that, right? Well, why do you spend all that time at the church serving when you could be having more fun doing other things? Moms, right? Why are you staying at home when you should be working? Hey, why are you working when you should be staying at home? You can't even win that one, right? There's constant criticism coming at you. And your friends unleash at you and your coworkers unleash at you. How do you respond? How do you answer that? How do you do it gently? There's not a lot of great examples in our culture on social media how to do this gently, right? People just unleash at each other. Well, it comes down to not reacting, but instead responding. When you're criticized and you react, you're full of emotion, and you just give them whatever you got on emotion. But when you respond, you're spirit-filled, you're patient, and you're pursuing wisdom. Why does that matter? Because wisdom in that situation is not about winning. When you react, it's about winning. When you respond, it's about wisdom. It's not about winning an argument or winning the battle. It's about having wisdom. In the Old Testament, there's a great example of how to answer criticism from a guy named Gideon. It's found in the book of Judges, chapter 8. And he answered some criticism that was leveled at him. He was taking some heat for making a choice. And verse 1 of Judges chapter 8, this is what he says. He goes, "Now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, 'Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you wanted to go fight the Midians?' They challenged him vigorously." Some translations say they harshly criticized him. He made a decision. "Why didn't you call us?" They're all upset. They're all in arms. And he's like, "Man, they're just flying darts at me, right? They're criticizing me." So what did he do? Well, he could have put on the boxing gloves. He could have fought. He didn't. He could have taken off and said, "I don't want to deal with the conflict." He didn't avoid it. He didn't take flight. Instead, in verse 2, he answered it. He answered them. He said, "What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Ebenezer? And you're like, wait a minute. What is this about? This is about grapes. Basically, Gideon's like, hey, listen, something went down here. God gave a provision of grapes. The whole story's about grapes. It's a great story, right? Whole thing there. He's like, but there's a really logical reason. God gave it, and he blessed, and it worked out for the good, didn't it? He answered him gently. And look what happens in verse 3. At this, the resentment against him subsided. There are some times when a critic hasn't listened completely or hasn't listened at all, that if you answer gently and you give a context, that the person will understand and go, oh, I get it. I understand it. So probably one of the greatest pieces of advice I've learned here is the power of the pause. A pause can help you take a breath, think, pray, think some more, and wait. It's funny how when someone criticizes you, how it sounds and feels one day, and on a night of sleep or 2 nights of sleep or a week of sleep, it can take on a little bit different narrative. You give it some space. One discipline I was taught years ago was never respond to the criticism until you've prayed for the criticizer or the critic. Over the years, I've added to that, okay, I'm going to never respond to the criticism before I pray for the critic, and I'm never going to respond to the criticism before I pray the critic out of me. I got to kill the critic inside first. There's so much power in a pause. Pause before you answer it gently. Because I'm afraid that if you don't pause, you'll answer it, but probably not gently, right? Third principle. Sometimes you dismiss it quietly. Sometimes you answer it gently. Sometimes you should adjust accordingly. Sometimes you should make the adjustment. Can I be real with you? Some of you in here, the people that you love have been trying to tell you something. They've been trying to tell it to you over and over and over and over and over again, and you're not listening. And it's because they love you. Maybe you're in a relationship and they keep telling you that you're dating Satan and they want you to get rid of the demon, right? And you're like, I'm not getting it, right? But all the people that you love are telling you this. Maybe if everyone you love is telling you something, you have something to learn. Just maybe. Emily Freeman wrote in her book, The Next Right Thing. I love this. There's a great quote about the critic. She wrote about criticism. She said this, the critic is a tricky companion. Now listen to this. This is really good for where we live. Because not all critics are created equal. Don't forget that. She goes on, she goes, just because someone is critical doesn't automatically mean you should ignore them and call them a hater. Oh my goodness. 2019, hello. Someone says something that you don't like, you're like, hater gonna hate. Or they're right. I mean, it's possible, right? Don't just throw everyone into the hater category because they say something you don't want to hear. This sermon's about overly critical people, not just some criticism you might need to hear. Then she goes on, she goes, but it also doesn't mean that they are right. The trouble comes when we allow all critical voices to weigh the same amount. The critiques to most seriously consider, don't miss this, are the ones coming from those who believe in you. When the people in your world that believe in you are saying something to you, listen. Listen to that. So I started asking myself this week, when was the last time that I listened to criticism from people who believe in me and I made an adjustment. How long has it been for you since you've adjusted to some criticism? If you can't remember or it's been a long time since that happened, I would humbly submit to you that you're missing out on some super great opportunities to grow. And you're simply surrounding yourself with people that say what you want them to say. I call that living in a vacuum. You're not going to go far with that. The author of Proverbs, again, reminds us of the power of correction and being teachable. The writer says, whoever heeds life-giving correction will be at home among the wise. Man, that's where I want to live. I want to live among the wise. If we live among the wise, we're going to rehab and restore some things we thought never could be. Those who disregard discipline despise themselves, but the one who heeds correction gains understanding. Such freedom found in being teachable and coachable and say, hey, I don't understand this, I don't have this all figured out, but I'm listening and I'm willing to make an adjustment for it. Listen, you can learn from anybody if you have a heart willing to do so. But to get there, your heart has to be secure. And when your heart is secure and you can hear criticism and you can adjust accordingly, you know what we call that? We call that mature. We call that mature. What a value it is to hear. So every week, I try to practice this. I invite feedback all during the week, during the process of writing the sermon and then delivering it. And so on Sunday morning, after the 9 o'clock hour, I leave the stage and I immediately invite feedback into my world from people who I know believe in me, okay? And so there's usually 3 or so people that are just like, you got to give me the feedback. So remember, I invite this. I ask them, like, hey, can you give me some feedback? They have freedom to talk about anything, content, delivery, anything about the sermon, okay? And they do. And when they give me feedback, I'm going to tell you how it feels. It hurts. I've invited them to do so, and I don't like it. And so usually the first thing in my soul is to say, do you have any idea how hard it is to do what I do? Clearly not. That's the Nick inside of me. That's what I want to say. But as I don't, and I listen, the feedback makes me better. And I have to adjust things so that we can win, not just me winning. These people don't just believe in me, they believe in we. And I thought about that, about how in my life I'm blessed because I have some men in my life who have free access to anything about me. And because of their constructive criticism and their feedback, I'm a better husband, I'm a better dad, I'm a better leader, I'm a better pastor, I'm a better friend because of it. I have not arrived there. But I'm better because of criticism. Constructive criticism from people who believe in me. And that's not easy to do all the time. But it's important sometimes. Sometimes you dismiss it. Sometimes you answer it, and sometimes you adjust. How do you know when to do which? How do you apply this? Wisdom. If I gave you that answer, I'd be God. You got to go through the process. Avoid being the critic yourself. Learn how to handle the critic by learning to apply those. But listen, let's just be real. One of the reasons we don't like criticism is because oftentimes when someone levels it, there's a nugget of truth, and we know we need it. We know we need to hear it. We know we need to do something with it, but we just don't want to because it's awkward, hard, and challenging. And then what happens is, this is the danger, because someone says something and I didn't want to hear it and I know I needed to hear it and it's so true because it evokes this inside fury in me, right? Then I grow a bitter spirit in my heart. And because of that, I lash out to other people. And all of a sudden, other relationships suffer because of my lack of ability to handle this. Some of you are the critic because you were criticized and you didn't know how to handle it. And the reason that you're so critical of everyone else is because you were criticized terribly at some point and you didn't figure out how to handle it. Just keeping it real. It can hurt. That's what happens when we lash out. And God has a prescription for this problem. It too is found in the book of Proverbs, chapter 4. The writer says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Everything you do. If you're going to do something, you're going to be criticized. So if you're going to be criticized, the only way to make sure that you can get on the other side of that and deal with it healthy is to guard your heart. To protect your heart. to make sure that your heart is leaning into who God says you are, not who the critic says you are, not who other people say you are, but who God says you are. It all comes down to the heart. The heart. Will you evaluate your heart today? Take a look inside and go, what's really, really inside of there? When we're overly critical or overly sensitive to criticism, people get crushed. And if we want to do some rehab, we want to find healthy, we're going to have to begin in the heart. So here's what I want to do this morning. I want to look at our hearts. I'm going to invite you to bow your heads, close your eyes. We're going to invite God in to have free reign in our hearts right now for just a couple of seconds. I want to invite you to take a look at your heart. When you look inside your heart, what do you see? Especially as it relates to criticism. Is there a scary reality that you've been the critic? And you know it's hurt people you love? You don't even want to be the critic. Guard your heart. To guard your heart begins with admitting that, acknowledging it, openly and honest. And so this morning, with no one looking around, just you and me, I'm going to invite you to admit it here today. You would say, I will admit it. I have been the critic. Raise your hand if that's you. No one else looking around. Say, I have been the critic. Man, thanks for your honesty. And put your hands down. Can I tell you, you've admitted it to me. I would encourage you to confess it to God. When you confess it to God, you agree that it's wrong. And then you make the choice to turn away from it. And this is where it's going to be challenging. To turn away from it is to take a step. And that step is going to look like, if you haven't already, going to the person or persons that you know you've been overly critical to and owning it. And saying, I have been overly critical of you. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Will you please forgive me? When you do that, you're choosing to be a student, not a critic. You're asking questions. You're like, oh man, I don't know if I can do that. It would take so much. Listen, you have no idea the power of a critical person coming to someone they've been critical of and saying, I need your forgiveness. There is so much power. It will blow your mind what could happen if you did that. Or maybe you're looking at your heart. Maybe when you look inside, you see, hey, you know what? I've been someone that struggles with criticism. I take it way too personally. I'm overly sensitive to it, and it's caused bitterness inside of me, and maybe bitterness towards the critic or other people or just life in general. And as soon as you deal with criticism, you become the critic, at least in your mind. Guard your heart. You guard your heart by leaning into the truth of who you are according to God. With no one looking around. If you're the person that would say, as I look at my heart, I've been overly sensitive to criticism, would you raise your hand? Just put it up. Yeah. Wow, thank you. Thanks for your honesty. Friend, can I encourage you to lean into who you are in Christ? Lean into who God says you are. When you do that, that's the way that you'll be able to respond rather than react. Just lean into who he says you are. Focus on who God says you are. Or maybe when you look inside of your heart, you're not really sure what you're seeing. Maybe it feels empty or alone or broken or hurting. And when you see your heart, you realize, man, something's not right. You've made a good identification because that's a problem all of us have. Our hearts are incurably sick with a disease called sin. It's when we choose to live our life rather than God's. Every person on the planet has the same illness there. And we need to replace our heart, but we can't do it on our own. So God, the Father, in all of his love that he has for us, offers a solution to that. He gives us a new heart that's available to you through Jesus, his son, as a sacrifice and substitute for you when he died on the cross in your place. But you have to make a choice to receive this new heart from him. And that new heart is good, and it is forgiven from all that you've ever done wrong and gives you hope for a future. Listen, you can't rehab your relationships until you replace your heart. And maybe that's where you are today. You look inside your heart and you need your heart to be renewed. You need to receive all of God's love and forgiveness for you in Christ. If that's you, no one looking around, would you raise your hands this morning? Thank you. Absolutely. Thanks. That's a decision that you'll never regret. If you were one of the individuals that just raised your hand, I would encourage you before you leave today, either find your way to the Connect room, share with someone the decision that you made, or on the front of your response card that was found in the worship program you were handed when you walked in, check the circle that says, "Today I choose to receive God's love and forgiveness for me in Christ." Let's pray together. God, thank you. Thank you for our time together today. Thanks for the genuine authenticity of this group of people who were willing to admit, you know what, I've been overly critical. God, I pray for those who admitted that to have the power to choose to be a student, not a critic. Thanks for those who admitted they've been overly sensitive. I pray for the power to respond rather than react. And for those who feel like their heart needs to be renewed and to begin a relationship with you, God, I thank you for the fact that they have received new life. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks for watching with us today. We hope it's been helpful and motivating to live the life God created you to have. Share with us your next step through your app, or use the app to ask questions or share a prayer request. You're always invited to join us on our campus for weekend services. Until next Sunday, though, have a great week.